In today's video, we're going to take a look at how we create the intro for the audience podcast and how you too can create a scripted monologue intro for your show, why it's better than just your standard generic intro, why it's not for everyone, but how it can really push the creativity and increase listenership and retain listenership for your podcast. As an example, I want to start off with listening to how most of us, myself included on a lot of my personal projects, introduce a podcast. Here it is. Not picking on John Barrows. I don't know him. I just searched for sales and marketing podcast because I feel like the way that sales and marketing podcasts do introductions, it's very common because it's the easiest path. You know, what I'll show you what we do is with audience, it's the harder path. What we do by default with a lot of our interview shows is pretty easy. Here's an example.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Make It Happen Mondays, where we talk about sales, business, entrepreneurship, personal growth, mental health, and everything in between with guests who I truly...
And that's fine. So like that, I just wanted to stop right here. And that introduction's fine. It's just like, there's always that music jingle, and then it's the Make It Happen podcast, and it's like, here's all the things we talk about. And that's okay, but it gets pretty boring after a while. Let's continue.
Really respect, and I think make a positive impact on the world around us. And this was a fun conversation I just had with Brandon Klausier. He actually is an enterprise AE over at Asana, but started...
saying things like, this was a fun conversation. This was a great conversation. It was great to you, but it really doesn't set the mood or the tone for the listener, especially if it's a new listener, and especially when everyone prompts their podcast with the start of this. Remember, it's never just about John in this case. It's never just about you. It's about the listener and what they're hearing across the whole spectrum of other podcasts that might compete with you. So when a lot of podcasts do it the same way, your listeners hearing this a dozen, half a dozen, 25 times in a given week, and it can just really start to create podcast fatigue for your listeners. So when you start to think about, okay, why is my show plateauing? Why am I not gaining the listenership that I think I should be? I had really great conversation with these people. Why aren't people subscribing? It's because we're all saying that, and we want to maybe think about it differently. Let's continue a little bit more.
His career in sales with no money, no college degree, and grinded his way all the way up to being a top enterprise sales rep over at Salesforce and now over at Asana, making President's Club. And during this conversation, we talk about a lot of stuff, but it really centered around him growing up with a real strong work ethic with his parents and kind of what they taught him about financial literacy and business acumen, and then realizing college just really wasn't for him. And he was washing dishes one day, and his roommate was a telemarketer.
So I'm just going to pause it there. I'm going to end it there for this, just as this example. Again, this is not wrong. This is just a very common way. And what I really want to hit home is a lot of us do it that way, which means your potential audience, we all hear the same thing, and we crave something different after a while. Sort of giving the whole journey of the person's background. I still have 56 minutes to go, or almost 57 minutes in John's podcast episode. I just want to make sure that I don't hear this backstory again. And that's one thing that is very challenging. This is the hard work. This is where the writing, the scripting, and the editing really comes into place. Because it's fine for John to set the stage to say, hey, my guest went from Salesforce to Asana, had this great background in business acumen from his parents. That's great. I just want to make sure I'm not hearing that again when I get into the show. Because what we do as creators, we fall into this trap. We have this great conversation, and we record it. It's 55 minutes. And then we sit down and we do the intro, and we start thinking about all of those things that we talked about. Man, wasn't that great? Wasn't that awesome? And we just kind of regurgitate it back out as the introduction. And it doesn't really hook the listener. It gives them this big blanket of coverage, which is okay for some, but it doesn't really drill down on any one specific topic, one specific value point. It doesn't set a mood. It doesn't set a tone. It doesn't really hook me in. Okay. Now, again, I know a lot of this is subjective, and I don't mean to pick on John. Okay. John sure seems like a fairly nice guy. But let's just talk about doing a scripted podcast introduction. I'm going to play our audiogram of our introduction and sort of do the same thing. I'm going to pause and continue as we expand upon it. This is the Audience Podcast.
Central characters are what drives virtually every story ever told. Writ large, good stories have compelling characters. That's true across pretty much all mediums and genres, I think. And with the rise of fiction podcasts and docuseries, podcasters who want to tell better stories, need interesting characters.
It's about, showing a
So we haven't said who the guest is. We gave you one topic that we want to hit home on. You want to make better fiction podcasts or docuseries or something like that. Create better characters, telling better stories, better characters. Aren't you interested in that? If you're not, yes, you can certainly leave. But you might still be curious, well, what is he going to get to in here? Maybe not ready to leave yet because you didn't just throw everything onto the kitchen table for me, but you gave me one nugget to really think about. And now that's sort of stuck in the back of my mind. No music, no jingle yet. We're not setting the tone with audio or any kind of audioscaping right now. Now we continue with the clips.
It's about, showing a real person who's flawed and doesn't do what we maybe want them to do, the heroic thing to do.
Next, you'll hear how a team of writers, producers, and actors banded together.
So now that clip is from the guest, which we're about to talk about, Stuart's about to talk about in the monologue. We set the tone a little bit with the music, and she sort of reinforces the point about how interesting characters can be. Not just, yes, you make interesting characters, but like challenge that a little bit, and then we continue on.
To create a high-concept podcast with a complex protagonist. My name is Stuart, and this is Audience, a Castos original series.
So what you're going to talk about is what we're going to hear from these writers who banded together to create these complex characters and protagonists for a story. So again, still keeping you hooked. It's still a bit of storytelling in this introduction. Now, I'm not saying that we're winning awards for it, although I'd really love if you nominated Audience for any podcast award at this point. But it's not just taking that standard approach of let me just dump all the cards on the table and this is what you're going to get. Now we do the introduction to the podcast.
A Castos original series for podcasters in pursuit of creating better audio and uncovering the business that powers audio creators.
So that's our premise. It's something that we're always working on. We've had many iterations of it so far. I don't think a premise is ever sort of really complete, but it's not just a couple of bullet points. Like this is what we're passionate about. I'm not saying you have to do this too with your podcast or structure it the same way, but this is how we introduce you to Audience, and now we get a bit of a call to action.
Speaking of making better audio, Castos could help. With our team of professionals, we can help you make your show. Add in our suite of integrative tools like Stripe or our private podcasting app, and Castos has everything you need to bring your podcast to life. Learn more by emailing hello@castos.com or by clicking on the link in the show notes.
A little bit of audio engineering, a little transition sound effect as we move into the next segment. Call to action, extremely important. It's one of the most overlooked things. Even in our friend John's example, sales and marketing show, there was no call to action at the top of that show. And so sometimes people say, I'm not here for the call to action. That's totally fine. But eventually at the end of the day, what we want to do is measure some level of success with our podcast, whether that's just the listeners going up, or what I like to do is, are we getting either more leads in the door, or are we getting newsletter subscribers, right? And that's a great sort of bellwether to see if you have a healthy, actionable audience in your show. It's something that gets overlooked countless times from countless customers that I talk to. And even if you say, well, it's okay, I'm not trying to put a call to action, I'm not trying to sell something, you should at least push to an email newsletter, because eventually you'll want to do something, or eventually you're going to start to get a little bit tired from doing the podcast. And maybe you need to see a metric that keeps you moving, that keeps you motivated to keep going. Let's keep going with this clip.
Audio fiction or audio plays.
Audio's coming in, setting the mood.
Whatever you'd like to call this particular genre, fictional podcasting, as, hey, it's like a TV show or a movie with your eyes closed,
That's Jenny Turner Hall, an award-winning writer and storyteller who's written some of the world's top fiction podcasts. She co-created, executive produced, and...
So what we didn't do is, hey, Jenny, welcome to the program. Tell us about yourself, right? There was none of that. There was none of that repeated backstory from our hook at the top of the show, or again, in the example we use at the top of this video, we're not just dumping all the cards on the table. It's not a repeat of all of that stuff. We're writing the introductions, we're writing the monologue to tie the story together. We're helping tell their story by creating our own story in this podcast.
wrote The Unexplainable Disappearance of Mars Patel,
Audio
a
still going,
serialized
setting the
mystery
mood.
podcast for kids. Her work on that series won a Peabody Award, and she also teamed up with Marvel to write and direct Wastelander's Wolverine. While it doesn't get quite the recognition as some of her other work, she also executive produced a series called A Simple Her Story. That title might be a bit misleading. The story's anything but simple, and that's kind of the point. It was created by Jocelyn Kuritsky, an award-winning actor and creator who founded the Muse Project, an initiative.
We're writing this to keep the listener engaged. So again, instead of just handing over the mic to the guest, which a lot of us do, again, guilty as charged, they'll start to go on about their backstory. They'll start pontificating about it. They could draw it out a little too long. What Stuart's doing is honing in on it, saying here are the awards, the accolades, the places that she's worked, and then expanding on what this project might be about, giving you a little bit of backstory that maybe the guest would have missed in your show. Again, I'm not saying this has to be done in all your podcast episodes, but when you're thinking about, storytelling and sounding compelling to your listener, I know I'm biased. I think Stuart's nailing it on the head.
That seeks to spotlight women theater actors. And A Simple Her Story does just that. It's about women who have run for president. There's more than 100, by the way. The first woman to ever do it was Victoria Woodhull, and she's the central character of season 1. Victoria Woodhull was a labor and suffragist activist who left behind an important, albeit complex legacy. As it turns out, she also makes for a fascinating protagonist for A Simple Her Story. Another little interesting twist to this is that the series features an all-female cast, even in the roles of men. To listen to it feels like part audio drama, part historical.
And then we're going to start to continue to build that backstory, build that interest in the show. I'm going to skip ahead just a little
fiction,
bit.
part experimental theater. Really, it's kind of hard to classify. That's not too surprising, considering it was written by Jonathan Goldberg, a playwright who has a reputation for making these well-crafted, zany audio dramas. So when Jenny found out about it, she was...
Now we're going to put you right into that story. Instead of us having an interview getting to this point, we're getting it to you right now at the start of the show.
pretty excited.
I was introduced by a playwright.
Music bed in the background,
Winter Miller,
setting the interesting
introduced
mood,
me to
getting you
Jocelyn
ready to
Kuritsky,
learn
and
more.
Jocelyn just had an idea for a podcast series, and that was starting to get written by Jonathan, and they had been talking about it for quite some time, and Jonathan was in the middle of writing it. And I said, I love the idea for A Simple Her Story.
So, and there we go. We get into the rest of the interview, and it goes on from there. I'm just using this intro clip as the framework for this discussion. So, scripted monologue, creating that story for the storytelling about to happen in the podcast. That's just the way that we approach it. It's a lot more work. It's thinking about the threads that you're going to pull on to create the introduction. How are you going to edit this together? Like which sound bites are you going to pull when you introduce your guest and the topic, and how you sort of tie that in to funnel the listener into the show. Again, I'm not saying that this is perfect for everyone or that everyone should do that. I just like to look at it as sometimes we get into a vacuum. We wonder why our show isn't performing well. We're just thinking about our show only. Like, this is a great podcast. This is great content. Why aren't people listening to it? It's because we're all saying that, and we're all creating a format of show that we want, your listener listens to, another half a dozen maybe, or a dozen other business podcasts or podcasts similar to what you're putting out. And eventually they get fatigue and they start to trail off. So you really want to think about pushing those creative boundaries. This is just how we do it with the audience. A little bit of a longer video here as we just listen to some clips and navigate and dissect them in and out here. But I hope you found that useful. If you did, leave us a comment in the comments below. If you have a different way of doing your intro, let me know in the comments below. Would love to hear more about it. Thumbs up if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more. See you in the next video.